Hey guys, it's Batman and I'm back with another speed draw thing, and in this one I am going to paint some Catbats. Now I was originally intended to do something like this around Halloween, but I just never got around to it, so I wanted to go and paint something a little bit more creepy. That's something that I don't really usually do too much, and I also wanted to do something that was a little bit more painty and more grayscaled. For a while before this as well, I'd been doing a lot of sketches of these different hairless cats and drawing all the wrinkles on them, and I wanted to go and do something where I could go and render all those wrinkles and kind of translate it from all the lines I've been drawing into something that was more painted. What I was originally going to paint was actually just a hairless cat kind of looking at itself in the mirror so that I could do something that dealt with like reflections and a little bit of subsurface scattering in the ears and such, but I thought, this is kind of a more interesting concept. It lets me play around with the anatomy a little bit and give them wings. It's also going to let me implement that subsurface scattering into the wings and their ears. And now that I've nearly got this one down, I'm going to put a little bit of indication of where I want the lighting to be, because I know I want it to be poking through the back of its ears and the wings and lighten those up so I can get quite a lot of saturation with the oranges in there on top of the kind of greyish blues that I'm going to put on it. And now I'm going to start adding in some other ones around it onto this little grid that I've put in. And I'm trying to keep them pretty loose just so that I can go and clean them up later, because I just want to make sure that I get my spaces that they're plotted into right at the moment, making sure that they fit in with this perspective grid that I've got going on. And I'm also going to add a further like swarm of them at the back so that I've got some that are just more silhouetted against this moonlight. And again, those are going to be pretty sketchy because I'm going to go and clean them up a little bit later. I just want to make sure that my placement is right. What I'm also going to do in a minute is try and pull a little bit more of that light around that I've just indicated at the moment, like where the moon's going to be and where it's going to come down onto that main one in the centre that we're going to be looking at. So I'm going to go and pull that around and see how that's going to reflect on the rest of them, and if I need to tweak the placement of them anywhere, or where the shadows are going to fall on the different ones, where there's little pieces of other bats obscuring it. What I'm also doing is going and adding in a little bit of a mountain range kind of in the background, or just a big ledge for them to have their little cave in up in the top right that they're all kind of flying out of, so that we've got a kind of progression of where they're going that makes sense. So it starts in one place and kind of swirls round into this main focus point, and I'm trying to get that to kind of work as a spiral, which I think I go and draw over at some point in green so that you guys can see it a little bit easier, as well as going and putting in a little grid of the rule of thirds to see if I can get everything to line up like that. So you can see I've got this main bat's face right at the front is lining up with where everything kind of has a cross section in the bottom corner. And now that I've got all that done, I'm going to go and start cleaning up the sketches for these, and then that's going to be my reference layer for when I'm doing the painting, so that I know where everything needs to go. And I'm trying to keep the lines pretty thin for this, which is something I'm still trying to work on a little bit more, keeping my lines thinner, so that the shapes that I draw are a little bit more accurate. They're not as kind of vague as when you use thicker lines, especially when there's all these little wrinkles and details in their skin. I want to make sure that I am putting those in the right place. And that when I go and do the painting and have these lines over the top, that I'm not going to be really obscuring anything too much with really, really thick lines. I'm trying to leave as much room as possible to see what's going on while still having the lines over the top. You can see I've got my big bunch of references down the side hanging about as well, so that I can move them around to wherever I need them next to. I actually went and got Pure Ref recently, which is a little program that lets you have a panel over the top where you can copy paste images and keep your references so that it's on top of whatever you're drawing on, and it stays on top, doesn't get put underneath the window. And I've been wanting it for ages actually, but I remember looking at it a long time ago and knowing that it was only for Windows, but they must have updated it so that they've got a Mac version, so I have that now. But I'm not sure if it's more comfortable for me to just use it actually in the file that I'm drawing on and just be able to move it around like that instead of messing about with different windows. I'm not sure. I'll probably get back to you guys on that later in terms of whether I prefer it or not, or if I'm gonna keep using that more. At the moment, without having messed with it too much, I'm kind of preferring just keeping everything in my file because it gives me a little bit more room. I can turn it on and off, and it's not as many kind of movements to go and move it out of the way if I need to. That said, if it's something that you guys haven't heard of, I'd recommend going and checking it out because it is very, very useful if that's kind of something that you would prefer instead of just having your references in the file. Anyways, I'm starting to clean the rest of these up now with the lines, and I'm trying to get a few of them that are kind of licking their chops and stuff, and having them either snarling so that we get all these more pronounced wrinkles around their noses and everything, and we get to show like their cheeks and where their whiskers are going to be coming from, and if I have them snarling, it's going to make their whiskers kind of stand out a little bit more. When cats actually go and attack things and chase after mice and stuff, they can only see so far in front of them, and as soon as anything gets too close, they can't see it. It all blurs out because of how big their eyes are, I think, and how far apart they are. It's difficult for them to focus on things that are really close, so what they do instead is puff their whiskers out and use them to sense where the thing they're trying to catch is. So if they've got a mouse right in front of their nose, they will puff their whiskers out in front of them to sense where exactly it is so that they can go and bite it. So I'm trying to get the same kind of look on these where they've got their whiskers puffed out ready to catch all the little bugs or anything that are flying about, or maybe some unfortunate birds that haven't quite gone into roost yet. Okay, so the lines for these are mostly cleaned up now. You can see with the wings as well, I've gone and defined exactly where the bones are so that I know the kind of shapes that I need to put in the skin when it's kind of squashed over the top of them. So I'm not going to be defining them as much as I have with the lines in the painting, but it's just letting me know the structure of them and where they are. So now I'm starting to block everything in, and what I'm going to do with these at the front is separate them into two different layers so that they're a little bit easier to do, because there's quite a lot of overlapping in some places, like this one's wing cuts in front of that one's head and body mostly, so I don't want to have to go and keep defining all these edge lines. So once I've got this blocked out as one big chunk, you can see it just kind of blends into one big shape. So I'm going to cut them apart into two different layers and different shapes that I can paint on. And you should be able to see that now in where there are ones that are white and ones that are slightly kind of greyish, just to define where they are at the moment. I'm also going to go and do the same for all these bats in the background, and they're just going to be on a single layer of me defining the shape so that I can go and paint inside of it later. And we're not going to watch the whole of me cleaning these up and sharpening them out. So let's skip that ahead a little bit to where they're all done, and now I'm going to start blocking in my different values. And the way I'm doing this is just using all these single layer bases that I've gone and put down, and I'm locking the transparency for each of them and painting inside those shapes. Just to get all my different values down. You can see I've got that line layer over the top, and it's not really interfering with it too much. It looks a little bit washy right now to the point where you can't really even see a lot of the lines. And once I get the paint into a certain stage where I can tell where all the details are and what's going on, once I've got more of the values down, and got it cleaned up a little bit more, then I can get rid of the lines altogether because I won't need them as a guide anymore. So you can just see I am blocking all these different lights in to make sure that it makes sense. I've got that main light chunked in on the wing and where it's going to be glowing through it, and on the ears as well. Something that I usually do with this kind of process as well, where I'm trying to make everything a little bit more clean and rendered, what I'll do is block all the values out just for one light source, and then I'll go and add the little bits of bounce light in, like on this main bat at the front. You can see all this bounce light from the one underneath it, and he's got this little bit of glow just around his belly defining the edge there. I'll usually go and do that later, but I thought with this one I'm going to try and do it all at the same time and just make sure that my values make sense, since it's not as difficult when you're not messing about with a bunch of different colours. When I get a little bit bored of it, like you could just see what I was doing then was going and messing about with colours over the top and just tinting it slightly, because after a while of painting a single thing like this, I do get a little bit tired of it and want to switch it up a little bit and do something else that just changes my mindset for a minute or something, so that I can kind of see what's wrong with it in any places. It gives me like a little bit of a break, but it also makes me a bit more interested in continuing with it. So I'll go and mess with different overlays and see what colours I can put over the top, to give me a little bit of a better idea of how the finished thing's gonna look, and just kind of reboot my interest in getting it finished. Give me a little bit more motivation for it. So what I plan on doing with this one is to make it all grayscale, like I mentioned, have it be a little bit more towards a silverish blue, like the past illustration that I did of a bunch of cryptids. I'll put a link to that speed paint at the end, and then have a little bit of orange glow wherever there is any kind of subsurface scattering, and I'm also going to make their eyes glow so that they stand out more. So I've just got those colour layers over the top, and I've got them turned off at the moment so that I can keep going and playing with my values. And you can see there again, I've turned it on just to see what it's going to look like, and then turned it off again to carry on with my painting. because I know what colours I'm going to go ahead with, but it's better for me to continue just working on making sure that my values are correct before I put them in. I don't want to go and put the colours in too early because it might end up getting a little bit messy. And now I've pretty much got all my basic blocks down, and I'm starting to noodle them out a little bit more. So you can see on this cat at the front, I've just started to go and put some more detail into the wrinkles, bring the light around on that. I'm starting to put a little bit more detail into where their ribs are, and they've got wrinkles on their legs where the skin's being pulled around. At the moment too, I'm just using mostly the airbrush at different levels of hardness like I usually do when I'm doing more rendered stuff, just to get the base down on everything and make sure that my values are right and I've got all the soft edges. And then once I've got those, I go and add in some of the sharper edges that I want to put in with a more chunky brush, because then it's just a case of selecting a value that I've already got down and pulling it around. What I intend to do in the future is do more painty stuff that's got more texture to it now that I've got some different brushes to use. But most of the stuff I do like that is probably going to be starting off in the same kind of way as this, and then just doing it more as a over painty thing later with more of the texture like I usually do, and just soften it out with some different brush strokes rather than just having all these soft gradients going on. And you can see now I'm just starting to swap the brush out a little bit and use one that is a little bit sharper to put like that heavier shadow from where the ear is onto his face, and putting in some more of the wrinkles and little shadows underneath them. You can see at this point as well, I'm starting to get rid of the lines that I've got, because with the face being a bit more cleaned up now, it's starting to become a bit more obvious where all these wrinkles and everything are, and you can see I'm starting to go and put those in a little bit more chunky. And I'm still going to be flipping those lines on and off to make sure that I'm still keeping everything in the right kind of place, because if you just completely get rid of them, then things can tend to end up warping around a little bit, or become not as solid as when you put the lines on top. So I'm not really into doing what some people do, which is where they will leave the lines on and then just keep painting over the top of them and end up kind of meshing them into the painting. I want to keep those lines to make sure that I am keeping everything consistent with like the perspective and everything, and making the structure still be consistent, because I don't want to end up with any wonky cat faces. Anyways, starting to pick at these other ones at the back. I'm trying to fade those out a little bit more, so I'm going to not have as much contrast on those since they're a little bit further back. We're going to get a little bit more of that moonlight kind of washing in over the top of them, and a little bit more shadow because they don't really have their head angled in the right kind of way. But we're also just going to get a little bit of bounce light around them to light them up and bring their silhouettes out a little bit. What I'm going to do afterwards as well, which is why I'm not really noodling this completely, especially with the Catbats that are a bit further back or closer towards the front, is I'm going to go and blur out some of the stuff in the back so that there's a little bit of focus on everything, and it's mainly on this one at the front. And I'm also starting to go and clean up the wings a little bit now. You can see in this one that's got the light behind it and has got all that subsurface scattering is, like I mentioned, around the bone a little bit less defined, because the way it's kind of catching the light is going to just bounce all the light around inside of it, even when it is going around the edges of these bones. So it's just a little bit of a lighter colour to indicate where that light is bouncing around inside that skin membrane. What I'm also going to be doing later is going and adding all the little veins and everything into those wings as well, to add a little bit more detail into them, and messing about with the colours again like I do. And you can see I'm also starting to go and add in all these darker shadows around that bottom bit, where there are going to be like pretty close cast shadows from one bat onto the other ones. I'm also going to start cleaning up the background a little bit more pretty soon, because the values are a little bit vague there. It's not really that dark, and though I don't want it to be super dark so that we can actually see what's going on, I do want it to look a little bit darker and spookier. Now that I've got all my more detailed bits down as well, to the point where I can tell what's going on, I'm starting to use these chunkier brushes. You can see the edges on the lines that I'm making and the different shapes I'm drawing on are starting to get a little bit sharper than when I was using the airbrush, but I'm also going and still using it just to soften out any of these shapes where there's quite a lot of light bouncing about. And back to these ones down in the left corner where they need a little bit more noodling, just a little bit more of shadow and everything. And like I mentioned, there's not going to be a whole lot of contrast on them. The most contrast I want is between where they've got all these shadows on their face and where they're going to have glowing yellowish orange eyes. And then I'm going to zoom out again in a second after I noodle this one a little bit, and we're going to see what it looks like all together so I can see where all my values are and where the main point of attention is with this one with most of the light hitting it. And just checking my colours again to see if they are working right. I've got a really nice silvery blue that's going to be over the whole thing, so all of these greys are going to be tinted slightly kind of green blue. I did have quite a bit of a fight with the values on this one actually, because I knew I wanted it to make it a nighttime scene, but I also didn't want to make it too dark to the point where everything was just kind of bleeding into each other, especially because I've got so many little silhouettes of all these different bats hanging about in the background, and you know, I want it to be a little bit darker at the front so we got more contrast there, but it also needs to be dark in the background because we've got the cliff that they're coming out of and the cave. So instead I decided to make it kind of a little bit brighter so that I can get all this subsurface scattering and everything that I want. I can get the really nice contrast at the front that I want, and while that's going to brighten it up and not make it look as much like a night scene as I might have wanted, because I'm going to go and put this blue over the top, that's going to bring it more into that sort of feeling. And anyways, now that I've got all these at the front noodled out a little bit more, I am starting to pay a little bit more attention to the swarm that I've got in the background, giving them a little bit more detail. I'm trying to keep them quite blocky right now, because they don't really need to be overpainted because they're not super close to the screen. We just mainly need them as blocks of value so that we can tell where the light's hitting them. So I'm just going to do those in a sharper brush and then fade them out a little bit, and I'm going to end up putting those coloured gradients over the top later as well, so that's going to affect the values a little bit too. Something else that I'm going to do is darken the sky a little bit because it's really bright right about around there right now, and it's kind of too much of a grey up in this top corner where I want a little bit more contrast with those ones that are against the sky. And these last few that are a little bit closer, again, I'm doing kind of blocky at the moment and they're looking a bit out of place against these more painted ones, but they are going to get a little bit more detail on them pretty soon. I've skipped this ahead a little bit just now as well so that you can see where I've added a little bit more contrast to that cave up in the corner so that it's a little bit easier to see it and where they've come from, so that's also a point where there's more contrast and we can look at a little bit easier and kind of follow it through from those ones at the back right through to the ones at the front. I've added a little bit of a hint of trees down below and some texture into the side of the mountain. And the last little thing I do before I start going and messing with colours a little bit more heavily is just going and adding this little bit of kickback from the light and where it is hitting all of these just around the edges and everything, like around the edge of his ears and the wings, where there's going to be the most light hitting, and it's just kicking out a little bit of a gradient from it so that that light looks more realistic. And now that I've got that, we are starting to get more into the colours. I did have them slapped down kind of scruffy before, but now I'm starting to clean them up a little bit. So I've got my nice blue-grey over the top and then some orange over the top of that, just in some select little places that I want to light up. So we're going to get that kind of nice glow on the inside of their wings. We're going to get that in their ears where it's lighting up through there. I'm going to give them it in their mouths as well, and the eyes are going to be glowy, and I'm going to add more saturation to those later so that they stand out more. But this has given me a nice base for the colours. I'm also going to go and tweak the values on it because I really don't think it was as dark as it could have been. I wanted it to have a little bit more contrast, especially at the front. Sometimes when I'm painting with values and stuff, I don't realise that I'm going too close towards midtones and I'm not really retaining the shadows as I kind of pick at it more, so I just needed to go and put those in a little bit. And now you can see it's starting to come together as a thing. It's got a little bit more life to it now that I've got some colour in it. And that means that it's time to start the overpainting. Now at this point I have gotten rid of the line art pretty much. I might turn it on a couple of times just to check it and make sure, but I want to change the faces like slightly so that they look like they're snarling a little bit more, because this one looks a bit bored right now, so I'm going to pull those shapes around into more of a snarl. And the way I'm doing this is just with a single layer over the top of everything else, and I'm using the colours at this point as well, so I'm just eyedropping what colours I've got down already and pulling them around to put some more sharper detail on with just a kind of chunky sharp brush that isn't going to be all washy. I might use a little tiny bit of a gradient like I did in the wings there to add a little bit of movement to those in the wrinkles, but mainly I'll try and keep the overpaint into a more solid brush so that I'm not doing any of this like really washy vague stuff that's supposed to cover a bigger area. That's what I've already done underneath to block it out already. So basically what I'm doing is just cleaning up what I've already got, and when you actually see the finished thing compared to without the overpaint on it, it doesn't really look all that different. It's just that some of the edges have been made a little bit sharper, so it doesn't make a huge difference, but it is all these like final little details of cleaning everything up. It's one of those things that takes a long time but doesn't actually look like a whole lot of work when you compare it to what you had before, which is kind of annoying sometimes, but it's just the difference between having a nice looking thumbnail and having a nice looking picture when it's zoomed in, because I've seen plenty of things where the thumbnails look fine and then you zoom in and it's like, oh, it's not really that finished, it's just, you know, the values look nice and the colours look nice, it just needs a little bit more detail on it. And there's some whiskers that I'm adding in. I'm also going to add a little bit of dribble because I kind of enjoy drawing dribble and the shapes that it makes. I've tried to light up those whiskers so that they're quite obvious as well, because I want all that moonlight to be catching them and lighting them up. I've also given them a tiny little bit of scruffy hair because I don't want them to be completely bald, because bats are kind of fuzzy sometimes, some kind of bats are. So I wanted to give them a little bit of just scraggly hair that can catch the light, which is also going to make them a little bit more gross and weird looking, which is exactly what I want. Now that I've noodled that one a little bit, I thought I was picking at that one a bit too much at the front, so I'm trying to shift around to all these different ones. I actually quite like the way these two in the corner look at the moment, because they're not really defined. There's a lot of like simple gradients and just a few little brush strokes to define them, and I think that actually looks quite nice, so I'm going to try to not overdo them, because I don't want to overwork them and lose that bit of simplicity that I have in just the definition of the shapes and how it's working well on its own. It almost kind of works as a bit of a fade out on its own, like the focus, just by having less detail on them, but I am going to go and put the little bit of blur around at the back of them later so that they're not as focused, but I could have potentially just left them as they were and not gone and put as much detail as I am doing on these right now, not as sharp. As I'm going along this, I'm also seeing some places where it's not really dark enough or it needs a little bit more shadow, so I'm trying to add those in as well, like the wing on that one that I've just done and the ears by here. What I'm also going to do as well is go and put maybe a multiply layer over the top just to add some shadows into different bits like I usually do, just to correct the values a tiny bit. Adding overlays and stuff like I've done with the colouring can end up changing the values of what you've got quite a bit depending on what colours you pick. I know in the newer versions of Clip Studio Paint there's some kind of layer mode that doesn't mess with your values too much, it will just colorize them, or I think that might be Photoshop actually, but that's not something that I can do, so I tend to just be very careful about the different colors that I'm picking. What I usually do is have a correction layer with a reduced saturation so that I can just test what it looks like in grayscale after I've added the colors on, just to make sure that it's not tweaking the shape and form of anything that I've drawn already too much, and if it is, then how I can potentially fix it. And I need to also clean up this one that's on the right side. He looks kind of goofy. I actually had to move his nose around a little bit because I drew it a little bit too far off to the side. I think someone mentioned that he kind of looks like a floating head because you can't see a whole lot of his body and his wings are up and it kind of looks like some big goofy ears, which I kind of agree with. He does look a little bit goofy. So that's something that I need to keep an eye on the next time I draw something like this, or something with that kind of angle where it's like quite foreshortened. In terms of timescale for this, I don't think I've mentioned that yet. It was around maybe 22 hours, 23, somewhere around there. It was quite a while from just starting with nothing to the finished thing, which also seems like I should have been able to do more in that time, but it does take quite a while. I'm not sure if it's just my process that I'm trying to like work on and improve, but I want to be able to do more stuff in that kind of time scale. Anyways, I'm starting to go and add all the veins into the wings. I think I went a little bit overboard with them and deleted them and redid them. I also went and did them on the base layer of the painting underneath so that it'd still have all of this orange applied to it in the same kind of colour. And this is getting to the point where it is nearly done now. I'm just adding in all these last little details. I think I go and add some more shadows over the top of everything. You could see me kind of flipping it on and off with the value change layer that I had already to see what it looked like underneath, just to check that I have actually been improving on it, just to make sure. Just last few little details, and then what I'm going to do is go and add some of the blur that I mentioned over it so that we get kind of a focus on this one in the center. I'm also going to add a little bit of just kick out glow from where we've got that bit of subsurface scattering, like under this wing on this one at the side. It's going to kick out that orange just a tiny bit. Just messing with my values a little bit again. I think I ended up bringing it more towards an orangey colour just to have it feel a little bit more spooky and have the Catbats have a little bit more of a kind of flesh colour so that they looked kind of creepy in that sense rather than just all the blue. And again, what I've done with that is just made it a layer over the top, and then I've made that layer not visible and carried on painting underneath. And the very last thing that I'm going to do is just go and add all of this blur in, paint out these ones in the back just a little bit so they're not as in focus. I'm also going to put it around the edges of everything on these ones that are just like a little bit further back, as well as the one that's at the very front. And there we go, it's finished. Thanks for watching, lads. I hope this helped. If it did, give us a like, share if you think it'll help someone else, and subscribe for new videos on Fridays. There'll be links down in the description to the Discord group if you want to come and chat art stuff with us, as well as a link to my commission information and where you can buy prints of stuff that I've already drawn, including this. Lastly, there'll be a link to the cryptids illustration speed draw that I mentioned, which you can also get prints of on shirts. Yeah, thanks for watching, lads. Bye-bye.